The journey begins. The airport was bustling with life as travelers of all backgrounds moved through the terminals, each carrying their unique stories and burdens. Among them was Justice Elena Hayes, a woman whose story had been anything but ordinary. Clad in a sleek navy pantsuit and a silk scarf tied elegantly around her neck, she carried herself with the kind of grace that only years of experience and unshakable determination could bring. Her presence was magnetic yet understated, an intentional balance she had perfected over the years. Elena was en route to Washington, D.C., a routine trip to attend a high-profile judicial conference. It wasn't unusual for her to travel incognito, blending into the sea of passengers. She relished these moments of relative anonymity. After all, in her line of work, public recognition often came with scrutiny and pressure. As she handed her boarding pass to the gate attendant, Elena offered a polite smile. The young woman scanned the pass, her expression betraying no sign of recognition. Elena appreciated the detachment. It allowed her to enjoy these moments without the weight of her title. The attendant handed back her pass with a practiced "enjoy your flight," and Elena proceeded down the jet bridge. Settling into her first-class seat, Elena sighed softly, the weight of her responsibilities momentarily lifting. She adjusted the hem of her dress, a tailored deep maroon sheath with understated gold accents. It was a gift from her closest friend, Maria, who had insisted she wear something worthy of her stature. Elena had laughed at the sentiment at the time, but now, as she caught her reflection in the window, she silently thanked Maria for the confidence boost. The flight attendants began their pre-departure checks, gliding through the aisles with practiced efficiency. Elena noticed a young flight attendant with auburn hair neatly tied back in a bun. She was meticulously checking the overhead bins, her posture ramrod straight. There was something about her that caught Elena's attention, a mixture of nervousness and determination that reminded her of her younger self. Elena opened her leather briefcase, pulling out a stack of documents bound with a red ribbon. The contents were a critical briefing for a landmark environmental case. A corporation stood accused of poisoning the water supply of a small rural town. The case was particularly close to her heart, as it encapsulated the very reason she had pursued law: to give a voice to the powerless. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft voice of the flight attendant. "Would you like anything to drink before takeoff, Mom?" Elena looked up, her eyes meeting those of the young woman she had noticed earlier. "Just water, please," she replied with a warm smile. As the attendant leaned over to place the glass on Elena's tray table, her elbow accidentally grazed the edge of the trolley. In a split second, the trolley jolted, and a metallic clang echoed as the corner snagged the hem of Elena's dress. There was a sharp sound of fabric tearing. Both women froze. "Oh no," the flight attendant gasped, her face flushing crimson. She immediately crouched to inspect the damage. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." Elena glanced down, her eyes catching the small tear at the edge of her dress. It was minor, but it was there, a blemish on something she had taken pride in. Her initial reaction was irritation, but she quickly swallowed it. This young woman didn't deserve the full weight of her frustrations. "It's all right," Elena said evenly, waving off the attendant's frantic apologies. "It was an accident." The woman's hands trembled as she offered a napkin. "Please, let me try to." "It's fine," Elena interrupted gently, her voice calm but firm. "There's no need to make a scene." "Thank you, though." The attendant stood, her face still flushed. "I truly am sorry, Mom," she murmured before retreating hastily. Elena sighed, brushing a hand over the tear. It wasn't the end of the world, but the incident left a bitter taste. She wasn't upset about the dress itself, but about the feeling of being overlooked, a thread woven deeply into her life experience. As one of the few black women to hold such a prestigious role, she was used to being underestimated. The feeling of invisibility, even in her accomplishments, lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the final preparations for takeoff. Elena set her focus back on the documents in her lap, determined not to let the incident distract her. The plane ascended smoothly, the cityscape below shrinking until it became an indistinct patchwork of colors. Elena flipped through the pages, underlining key points and jotting notes in the margins. The facts were damning, but the corporation's legal team was formidable, and she anticipated a hard-fought battle in court. Her concentration was broken when the same flight attendant returned, her steps tentative. She stopped a few rows away, her hands gripping a tray of drinks tightly. The woman's discomfort was palpable, and Elena felt a pang of sympathy. "Excuse me, ma'am," the attendant said softly, approaching again. I wanted to apologize once more." Elena looked up, her expression softening. "Apology accepted. Don't worry about it. Things happen." The woman nodded, but instead of leaving, she hesitated. I don't mean to pry, but are you Justice Hayes, the Supreme Court Justice?" Elena raised an eyebrow. It wasn't the first time she had been recognized in public, though it rarely happened on flights. "I am," she admitted after a pause. The flight attendant's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my goodness, I didn't realize. I'm so sorry about earlier. If I had known." "You would have been just as apologetic, I hope," Elena interrupted, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I don't expect special treatment, Ms. Grace Miller," the woman stammered. I feel terrible." "Grace, take a deep breath," Elena said, her tone soothing. "It's just a dress. Let's not make it more than it is." Grace nodded, though her expression was still fraught with embarrassment. "Thank you for being so understanding." Elena offered her a reassuring smile, but as Grace walked away, she couldn't shake the thought that this young woman's reaction reflected something larger, a societal tendency to see only titles, not the person behind them. As the flight continued, Elena leaned back in her seat, letting her gaze drift out the window. The clouds rolled by, serene and untouched. For all her power and influence, she was just another human being on this flight, subject to the same turbulence as everyone else. Little did she know, this flight was about to take a turn, one that would leave an indelible mark on everyone aboard. The weight of recognition. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, the cabin settled into a tranquil rhythm. Passengers were engrossed in their books, laptops, or quiet conversations. Justice Elena Hayes, however, found it difficult to concentrate. She stared at the legal documents on her lap, the ink blurring as her thoughts wandered back to the young flight attendant, Grace Miller. Elena wasn't sure why the brief exchange had stayed with her. She had endured far more stressful situations in her career, grueling cross-examinations, contentious courtroom debates, and even public protests. Yet there was something about Grace's nervousness, her earnestness, that lingered in Elena's mind. Perhaps it was because Grace reminded her of herself at a younger age, uncertain, eager to prove her worth in a world that often seemed indifferent. Her memories drifted to her early days in law school. She had been one of the few black women in her class, a fact that hadn't gone unnoticed by her peers or professors. The weight of representation had been suffocating at times. Every word she spoke, every paper she submitted, felt like it carried the expectations of an entire community. There had been moments of doubt, of wanting to quit, but she had persevered, fueled by an unwavering belief in justice. Elena adjusted the hem of her torn dress absent-mindedly. The tear was small, barely noticeable unless one looked closely, but it symbolized something deeper, how easily even the most carefully constructed things could be disrupted by life's unpredictability. It was a metaphor, she realized, for her own journey. Her reverie was interrupted by the arrival of another flight attendant. This time, it was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and an air of authority. He stopped by her seat, his expression professional but warm. "Justice Hayes," he began, his tone measured. "I wanted to personally apologize for the earlier incident. Grace mentioned it to me, and I assure you it's not reflective of the level of service we aim to provide." Elena looked up, slightly startled. It was unusual for someone to address her by title in such casual settings. She offered a polite smile. "There's no need to apologize further. It was an accident, nothing more." The man nodded, but there was a hint of unease in his demeanor. "Even so, we take great pride in ensuring the comfort of all our passengers, especially someone of your stature." Alina tilted her head slightly, studying him. "My stature? I'm just another traveler like everyone else on this plane." "Of course, ma'am," he replied quickly, though his tone suggested otherwise. "If there's anything you need during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask." With that, he left, leaving Alina to her thoughts once again. She couldn't help but feel a pang of discomfort at the deference. While she appreciated respect, she had never sought to place herself above others. Her role as a Supreme Court justice was not about power but about service, a responsibility to uphold the law and protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The flight attendant's heightened attention toward her hadn't gone unnoticed by the other passengers. A man seated across the aisle leaned over, his curiosity piqued. He was in his late 40s, dressed in a sharp suit, with the air of someone accustomed to business class. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low. "Are you really Justice Alina Hayes?" Alina hesitated for a moment. It wasn't unusual for her to be recognized, especially in professional circles, but she valued her privacy during moments like this. Still, there was no use denying it. "Yes, I am," she replied simply. The man's eyes widened slightly, a mixture of awe and respect evident in his expression. "It's an honor to meet you. I've read about your work. Your ruling on the Phillips environmental case was groundbreaking." Alina nodded politely, unsure of how to respond. She was used to receiving praise for her work, but it always felt surreal in personal interactions. "Thank you. It was a team effort, as all cases are." The man leaned back, clearly wanting to continue the conversation, but sensing her reserved demeanor. "Well, if I may say so, your work inspires many of us. Keep fighting the good fight." She smiled faintly. "I'll do my best." As he turned back to his laptop, Alina felt a wave of mixed emotions. She was grateful for the acknowledgement, but also keenly aware of the pedestal upon which people placed her. It was a precarious position, one that came with both admiration and intense scrutiny. The hum of the engines provided a soothing backdrop as Alina finally managed to focus on the documents before her. She flipped through the pages, highlighting key points and jotting down notes. The case was complex, involving layers of corporate deception and environmental negligence. If the plaintiffs succeeded, it could set a precedent for holding powerful companies accountable, a step toward justice for marginalized communities. Her concentration was broken once more, this time by a soft knock on the edge of her tray table. She looked up to see Grace standing there again, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "I'm sorry to bother you," Grace began, her voice hesitant. I wanted to thank you." Alina raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For being so kind earlier," Grace said, her cheeks tinged with pink. "I didn't expect someone like you to be so understanding." Alina leaned back in her seat, regarding the young woman thoughtfully. "Grace, kindness shouldn't be surprising. It should be the norm." Grace nodded, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "It's just, most people in your position wouldn't have reacted the way you did." Alina studied her for a moment, noting the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. There was more to this young woman than met the eye. "Grace, may I ask you something?" "Of course," Grace replied, her posture straightening. "What made you choose this job?" Grace hesitated, glancing around as if ensuring no one else was listening. "Honestly, it wasn't my first choice. I wanted to go to law school, but life happened. Family responsibilities, finances, you know how it goes." Alina's chest tightened at the admission. She knew all too well how life's obstacles could derail even the most determined individuals. "Law school, you say?" Grace nodded, a wistful smile playing on her lips. "It's always been a dream of mine. To fight for justice, to make a difference. But dreams don't pay bills." Alina's gaze softened, Dreams are what keep us going, Grace. They're worth fighting for, even when the odds are against us. For a moment, Grace seemed to consider her words, her eyes bright with a mix of hope and doubt. Do you really think it's possible? For someone like me? Elena smiled. Grace, if I've learned anything in my life, it's that someone like you is exactly who the world needs. You've already shown resilience and determination. Those qualities will take you further than you think. The young woman's eyes glistened with unused tears. Thank you, Justice Hayes. That means more than you know. As Grace walked away, Elena felt a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't often that she had the opportunity to connect with someone on such a personal level. For all her legal victories and professional achievements, it was moments like these that reminded her of the true impact she could have, not just in courtrooms, but in the quiet, everyday interactions that shaped lives. As the flight continued, the atmosphere in the cabin seemed lighter. Grace moved through the aisles with renewed confidence, her earlier nervousness replaced by a quiet determination. Elena watched her from afar, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She had no doubt that this young woman had the potential to achieve great things. But Elena's own journey was far from over. She returned to her documents, her mind once again focused on the task ahead. The case waiting for her in Washington was a battle she couldn't afford to lose, not for herself, but for the people who had placed their trust in her. What Elena didn't know was that this flight, and the people she encountered on it, would lead to an unexpected chain of events, one that would test her resolve and reaffirm her purpose in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The journey was just beginning. The unexpected turbulence. The plane cruised smoothly above the clouds, the landscape below obscured by a sea of white. Justice Elena Hayes had finally managed to immerse herself in her work. The legal briefs sprawled across her tray table were daunting, filled with jargon and charts that painted a damning picture of the corporate negligence she was set to address. Her pen moved deftly, underlining key points and scribbling annotations in the margins. Yet, even as she worked, she couldn't help but notice how her earlier conversation with Grace lingered in her mind. The young flight attendant's quiet vulnerability had struck a chord. Grace had reminded Elena of the challenges she had faced as a young woman, of balancing ambition with the harsh realities of life. It was a delicate thread that connected them, bridging the gap between their vastly different lives. Suddenly, a slight jolt interrupted her thoughts. The plane shuddered, and a few gasps rippled through the cabin. Elena instinctively gripped the armrests, her body stiffening as the turbulence intensified. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll navigate through this shortly." The calm, practiced tone did little to ease the growing unease in the cabin. Elena glanced around, observing how the passengers reacted. Some clutched their armrests, their eyes darting nervously. Others appeared unfazed, accustomed to the unpredictability of air travel. The turbulence grew more pronounced, the plane dipping and swaying as if it were a leaf caught in a storm. Elena's stomach churned with each drop. She took a deep breath, willing herself to remain calm. Her years of courtroom battles had taught her how to face uncertainty with composure, but this was different. She was used to being in control, and here she was at the mercy of the elements. Grace reappeared, moving down the aisle with a reassuring smile plastered across her face, despite the obvious challenge of maintaining her balance. She stopped briefly by Elena's seat, her voice soft but firm. "Justice Hayes, is everything all right? Can I get you anything?" Elena looked up, appreciating the young woman's professionalism in the face of chaos. "I'm fine, thank you. How are you holding up?" Grace's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a glimpse of her nerves showing through. "It's a bit rough, but we're trained for situations like this." Elena nodded, her respect for Grace growing. It wasn't easy to maintain composure when faced with fear, not just her own, but that of others. "You're doing well. Keep it up." Grace straightened, her shoulders squaring as if Elena's words had given her strength. "Thank you, ma'am. Let me know if you need anything." The turbulence subsided after what felt like an eternity, the plane leveling out to a collective sigh of relief. Elena adjusted the pile of documents on her lap, but her focus had been disrupted. She decided to set them aside, folding her hands over the tear in her dress as her thoughts wandered. Her mind drifted back to her early career. She remembered a particularly grueling case where she had represented a single mother fighting an eviction. The odds had been stacked against them, but Elena had refused to give up. She had stayed up for nights on end, poring over legal precedents and crafting arguments. When the judge ruled in their favor, the look of relief on her client's face had made all the sacrifices worth it. Moments like that had fueled her journey to the Supreme Court. They were reminders of why she fought so hard, even when the system seemed insurmountable. And yet, even now, she sometimes questioned whether she was doing enough. The law was a powerful tool, but it had its limits. There were battles it couldn't win, wounds it couldn't heal. Her thoughts were interrupted by a commotion near the back of the plane. A voice, sharp and panicked, cut through the usual hum of the cabin. Elena turned in her seat, craning her neck to see what was happening. "Sir, please calm down," a flight attendant said, her tone measured but firm. "I need to speak to the captain," a man's voice demanded. He was standing, his face flushed, and his hands clenched into fists. "This plane isn't safe. I saw something. Something wrong with the engine." Elena's pulse quickened as she observed the scene. The man was visibly agitated, his voice growing louder with each word. Other passengers were starting to murmur, their unease spreading like wildfire. Grace appeared again, moving swiftly toward the commotion. Her expression was calm, but Elena could see the tension in her posture. She placed a hand on the man's arm, her voice soothing. "Sir, I understand you're concerned, but I assure you the captain and crew have everything under control. Please take your seat so we can ensure everyone's safety." The man shook his head, his movements erratic. "You don't understand. I'm telling you, I saw smoke." Elena's instincts kicked in. She had dealt with countless volatile situations in her career, and she recognized the signs of a man on the brink. Rising from her seat, she approached cautiously, her authoritative presence commanding attention. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady but firm. "What seems to be the issue?" The man turned to her, his eyes wild. "There's something wrong with the engine. I saw it through the window. They're not telling us the truth." Elena met his gaze, holding it with a calm intensity. "Sir, I understand you're afraid, but causing a scene will only make things worse. Let's take a step back and address this rationally." Her words seemed to pierce through his panic, and he hesitated. Grace seized the moment, gently guiding him back to his seat. "Please, sir, sit down and buckle up. I'll personally check with the captain and update you." The man muttered under his breath but complied, sinking into his seat. Grace shot Elena a grateful look, her lips mouthing a silent "thank you." Elena nodded, returning to her seat as the tension in the cabin gradually dissipated. Her heart was still racing, but she maintained her composed exterior. It was a skill she had honed over years of navigating high-pressure situations. As the flight resumed its tranquil rhythm, Grace approached Elena once more. "I wanted to thank you for stepping in back there. That could have escalated quickly." Elena waved off the gratitude. "You handled it well, Grace. I just gave him a nudge in the right direction." Grace hesitated, then added softly, "I've never seen someone command a situation like that. You have a way of making people listen." Elena smiled faintly. "It's a skill that comes with time and necessity." Grace seemed to mull over her words before speaking again. "You know, Justice Hayes, I've always admired people like you. People who can stand up in front of others and make their voices heard. I've never been good at that." Elena studied her, sensing the self-doubt behind her words. "Grace, leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about knowing when to speak and when to listen. You've already shown you can do that." Grace looked at her, a spark of hope lighting her eyes. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," Alina said firmly. "Don't underestimate yourself." For the first time, Grace's shoulders relaxed and a genuine smile spread across her face. "Thank you. That means a lot." As Grace walked away, Alina felt a sense of fulfillment. For all the challenges she faced in her role, moments like this reminded her of the power of connection. It wasn't just about the grand gestures or landmark cases. It was about the small, meaningful interactions that could change a person's life. Little did she know, the turbulence they had just faced was only a prelude. The flight had more surprises in store, ones that would test her resolve and redefine what it meant to lead. A storm in the sky. The hum of the engines settled into a steady rhythm as the plane sliced through the sky. Outside the window, dark clouds loomed on the horizon, their edges glowing ominously against the setting sun. Justice Alina Hayes shifted in her seat, her eyes flitting between the clouds and the stack of legal documents on her lap. She was trying to refocus, but the events of the last hour, the turbulence, the agitated passenger, and her conversation with Grace left her mind buzzing. Alina sighed softly, closing the folder and placing it neatly on her tray table. Her gaze drifted to the passengers around her. The business traveler across the aisle was typing furiously on his laptop. The couple in the row ahead whispered to each other, and a young boy in economy peeked curiously through the divider, his wide eyes full of wonder. It was a snapshot of humanity, a reminder of the interconnectedness of their lives, however fleeting this shared journey might be. A sudden announcement crackled over the intercom, breaking her reverie. The captain's voice was calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're approaching a weather system that may cause some turbulence. Please return to your seats and ensure your seatbelts are fastened. We appreciate your cooperation." Alina's eyes flicked back to the window, where the clouds now appeared closer and more menacing. She braced herself, gripping the armrests as the plane shuddered slightly. Around her, passengers exchanged nervous glances, the tension in the cabin palpable. Grace moved swiftly through the aisle, her composure unwavering despite the mounting anxiety around her. She stopped by Alina's seat, her voice calm but laced with concern. "Justice Hayes, can I get you anything?" The captain has advised everyone to stay seated for the remainder of the flight. Alina shook her head. "I'm fine, Grace. Thank you." Grace nodded and moved on, her focus shifting to the other passengers. Alina watched her go, marveling at the young woman's professionalism. It wasn't easy to maintain such grace under pressure, especially when faced with the growing unease of those around her. The turbulence grew worse, the plane jolting with increasing frequency. Drinks spilled, items slid off tray tables, and a baby's cry pierced the air. Alina's fingers dug into the armrests, her breath steady but shallow. She had flown through storms before, but there was something particularly unsettling about this one. The plane felt small and fragile, tossed about like a toy in the hands of an indifferent force. A loud crack of thunder echoed through the cabin, followed by a bright flash of lightning that illuminated the faces of the passengers. Gasps filled the air, and a few muffled prayers could be heard. Alina's heart raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. Fear was contagious, and she refused to add to the growing panic. The captain's voice returned, slightly more urgent this time. "Folks, we're encountering stronger turbulence than anticipated. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We're taking measures to ensure a safe passage through the storm." Alina closed her eyes for a moment, grounding herself with deep, steady breaths. She had faced countless storms in her life, both literal and metaphorical, and had come through stronger on the other side. This one would be no different, she told herself. But her thoughts were interrupted by a loud bang that reverberated through the cabin. The plane lurched violently to the side, and a collective scream erupted from the passengers. Overhead bins rattled, and a few unlatched, spilling their contents into the aisle. Alina's pulse quickened as she glanced around. A flight attendant struggled to close an overhead bin, while another rushed to calm a panicked passenger. Grace reappeared, moving with purpose despite the chaos. She stopped near Alina, her face pale but determined. "Justice Hayes," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We've got this under control. Please remain seated." Elena nodded, her respect for the young woman growing. But as she watched Grace move on, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The storm outside was unlike anything she had seen before, the flashes of lightning illuminating towering clouds that seemed to engulf the plane. The plane lurched again, and this time, the oxygen masks deployed with a sharp hiss. Panic swept through the cabin as passengers fumbled to put them on. Elena reached for her mask, her movements deliberate despite the fear clawing at her chest. The intercom buzzed, and the captain's voice came through, strained but controlled. "This is your captain. We're experiencing an electrical issue due to the storm. We're working to stabilize the aircraft. Please remain calm and follow the instructions of the crew." Elena's mind raced. An electrical issue. The implications were chilling. She looked around the cabin, her eyes meeting those of the passengers. Some were crying, others clinging to their loved ones. The business traveler across the aisle clutched his briefcase as if it were a lifeline. And then there was Grace. She was moving through the cabin, her voice calm as she reassured passengers and helped them secure their masks. Elena couldn't help but admire her courage. Grace was young, likely inexperienced in crises of this magnitude, yet she carried herself with the poise of someone far beyond her years. Elena's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden announcement from the captain. "Folks, we'll be making an emergency landing at the nearest airport. Please brace yourselves and follow the crew's instructions." The word sent a jolt of fear through Elena. An emergency landing. The very phrase carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. She adjusted her mask, her heart pounding as she prepared for what was to come. The cabin descended into a tense silence as the plane began its rapid descent. The hum of the engines grew louder, almost deafening, as the ground loomed closer. Elena gripped the armrests, her knuckles white, as the turbulence continued to shake the plane. Grace appeared once more, her voice rising above the din. "Ladies and gentlemen, please assume the brace position. We'll be landing shortly." Elena complied, leaning forward and clutching her knees. Her mind raced with thoughts of her family, her friends, and the work she had yet to finish. She thought of Lucas, her son, and the pride she had felt watching him graduate from law school. She thought of Maria, who had insisted on buying her the dress she now wore, torn but still beautiful. And then she thought of Grace, the young woman who had shown such courage and determination in the face of fear. Elena made a silent promise to herself. If they made it through this, she would do everything in her power to help Grace achieve her dreams. The plane jolted violently as it hit the runway, the sound of screeching tires filling the air. Passengers screamed, and luggage tumbled from the bins. Elena braced herself, her body tense, as the plane skidded to a halt. And then, silence. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the passengers and the faint crackle of the intercom. Finally, the captain's voice broke through. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've made an emergency landing. Please remain seated until instructed otherwise." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the cabin, followed by scattered applause. Elena sat back, her heart still racing but filled with gratitude. They had made it. Against all odds, they had made it. Grace appeared once more, her face streaked with sweat but lit with a smile. "Is everyone all right?" Helena nodded, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "Thanks to you, Grace. You did well." Grace's smile widened, and for the first time, Elena saw the depth of her strength. It was a reminder that even in the darkest storms, there was always light, always hope. But this journey was far from over. The storm may have passed, but its impact would ripple far beyond the confines of the cabin. For Elena, for Grace, and for everyone aboard, this flight would mark a turning point, a moment of clarity and purpose that would shape the paths they chose moving forward. Rising from the ashes. The aftermath of the emergency landing was a chaotic symphony of activity. Emergency vehicles surrounded the plane, their flashing lights cutting through the darkened runway like beacons. Inside the cabin, the passengers sat frozen, processing the terrifying ordeal they had just survived. A few whispered prayers of gratitude, while others held on to loved ones as if afraid to let go. Justice Alina Hayes remained seated, her breathing steady as she willed herself to calm the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She glanced out the window, the storm clouds finally breaking to reveal patches of clear sky. The chaos on the ground mirrored her thoughts, disorganized but alive. They had survived, but the weight of the experience lingered heavily. Grace Miller, the flight attendant who had been a source of calm throughout the ordeal, moved through the cabin, checking on passengers. Her voice was soft but steady, offering reassurance to those who needed it. When she reached Alina, their eyes met, and Grace's composure faltered for a split second. "Are you okay, Justice Hayes?" Grace asked, her voice tinged with concern. Alina nodded, her expression warm despite the lingering tension. "I'm fine, Grace. Thanks to you and the crew, we're all here." Grace smiled faintly, though her exhaustion was evident. "It was a team effort. We trained for this, but it's different when it actually happens." "You handled it with remarkable poise," Alina said, her tone firm. "You should be proud of yourself." Grace nodded, though she didn't seem entirely convinced. Before she could respond, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, emergency personnel will assist with disembarking the aircraft. Please remain seated until directed." The process of disembarking was slow but orderly, the passengers guided down inflatable slides to the tarmac. Alina descended carefully, her heels sinking slightly into the soft ground as she stepped away from the plane. The cool night air filled her lungs, and for the first time since the turbulence began, she felt a sense of relief. Around her, passengers huddled in groups, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. As the emergency personnel conducted checks and guided passengers toward waiting shuttles, Alina found herself standing apart, observing the scene. It was a stark reminder of life's fragility and the interconnectedness of every individual on that plane. They had shared a harrowing experience, and for better or worse, it had bound them together. Grace approached, her uniform slightly rumpled but her demeanor as composed as ever. "Justice Hayes, they've arranged for a shuttle to take you to a nearby hotel. Are you feeling all right to continue?" Alina turned to her, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I am, but Grace, you've been running on adrenaline for hours. How are you holding up?" Grace hesitated, clearly unused to being on the receiving end of concern. "I'm okay. This isn't how I expected today to go, but I'm glad everyone's safe." Alina regarded her thoughtfully. "You've shown incredible strength and leadership today. I hope you know that." Grace blushed slightly, looking down at her hands. "Thank you, ma'am. That means a lot coming from you." Alina placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Grace, you have the potential to do great things. Don't let fear or self-doubt hold you back." The shuttle ride to the hotel was quiet, the passengers lost in their thoughts. Alina sat by the window, her mind replaying the events of the flight. The fear, the uncertainty, and the courage she had witnessed all blended into a kaleidoscope of emotions. She thought of Grace, her resilience a beacon in the chaos, and wondered how many others like her were quietly fighting battles the world didn't see. The hotel lobby was a blur of activity as passengers checked in, grateful for a place to rest. Alina accepted her room key and made her way to the elevator. The suite was modest but comfortable, its neutral tones and soft lighting a stark contrast to the turbulence of the day. She sank into the armchair by the window, her briefcase still clutched in her hands. The legal documents she had been so focused on earlier now felt distant, almost trivial. The weight of her responsibilities was still there, but it was accompanied by a renewed sense of clarity. The flight had been a reminder, a jarring but necessary one, of why she did what she did. Justice wasn't just about laws and courtrooms. It was about people. It was about Grace, the frightened passengers, and the countless others who relied on systems to protect and uplift them. Elena leaned back, her gaze fixed on the city lights outside. She thought of her son, Lucas, and the sacrifices she had made to ensure he grew up understanding the importance of perseverance and empathy. She thought of Maria, whose unwavering support had been a constant in her life. And she thought of Grace, whose quiet courage had been a testament to the strength that often went unnoticed. The next morning, Elena joined the other passengers in the hotel dining room for breakfast. The atmosphere was lighter, the shared relief palpable. Conversations flowed more easily, and laughter punctuated the air, a stark contrast to the tension of the previous night. Grace entered the room, her uniform crisp but her movements slower than usual. She spotted Elena and made her way over, a tray of coffee and pastries in hand. "Good morning, Justice Hayes," Grace said with a small smile. "How are you feeling?" "Good morning, Grace," Elena replied, gesturing for her to sit. "I'm well. And you?" Grace hesitated before sitting down. "Tired, but I'll survive." They shared a moment of silence, sipping their coffee as the dining room buzzed around them. Finally, Elena spoke. "What's next for you, Grace?" Grace looked at her, surprised by the question. "I suppose I'll go back to work. Flights don't stop, even after something like this." Elena nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And your dream of going to law school?" Grace's eyes widened slightly. "I don't know. It's always been a dream, but I don't know if it's realistic." "Grace," Elena said, her tone firm but kind. "Dreams are meant to be pursued, no matter how daunting they seem. You've shown strength, resilience, and a natural ability to lead. Those qualities will serve you well in any field." Grace's cheeks flushed, but there was a spark of hope in her eyes. "Do you really think it's possible, even after all this time?" "I know it is," Elena replied. "And if you ever need guidance, I'd be happy to help." The young woman blinked, clearly taken aback. "You'd do that? For me?" Elena smiled. "Grace, people helped me when I needed it most. It's only right to pass that forward." As the passengers began to prepare for their onward journeys, Elena found herself reflecting on the flight and its aftermath. It had been a harrowing experience, but it had also been a moment of clarity, a reminder of the importance of human connection and the quiet strength that often went unnoticed. Before she left the hotel, she handed Grace a small envelope. Inside was her business card, along with a handwritten note. "Strength and resilience take you far, but belief in yourself takes you farther. Reach out anytime." Grace's eyes filled with tears as she read the note. "Thank you, Justice Hayes. I won't forget this." Elena nodded, her expression warm. "Neither will I." As she stepped into the car waiting to take her to her next destination, Elena felt a renewed sense of purpose. The storm they had faced in the sky was over, but the lessons it had imparted would stay with her forever. It was a reminder that justice wasn't just a profession. It was a calling, one that extended far beyond the walls of any courtroom. And in Grace, she had seen a reflection of the next generation, one that held the promise of a brighter, stronger future. The ripple effect. The journey back to Washington, D.C. the next day felt almost anticlimactic after the storm and emergency landing. Justice Elena Hayes leaned against the car seat as the driver navigated the streets toward her office. The city skyline came into view, its familiar outlines reassuring after the chaos of the past 24 hours. But something inside Elena had shifted, subtly but profoundly. As the car pulled up to the Supreme Court building, she glanced down at her briefcase, the legal documents inside now tinged with new meaning. The world of laws and precedents often felt detached from the human lives they affected. Yet the storm and the connection she had made on that plane reminded her of the humanity at the heart of every case. She carried that reminder with her as she stepped into the towering marble halls, her heels echoing softly against the polished floors. That afternoon, Elena sat at her desk, her office bathed in the warm glow of sunlight filtering through the tall windows. The torn maroon dress from the flight hung in a garment bag in the corner, a subtle but poignant symbol of the imperfections and resilience of life. She made a mental note to have it repaired, unwilling to discard it for the memories it now carried. Her thoughts turned to Grace Miller. Alina smiled faintly, recalling the young woman's earnestness and quiet strength. The note she had left with Grace felt like the beginning of something, not just for Grace, but for Alina herself. In her position of influence, she had the power to lift others as she climbed, and the encounter with Grace had reignited her commitment to do so. Deciding to act on the impulse, Alina opened her laptop and drafted an email to one of her contacts, a prominent dean at a prestigious law school. The subject line read, "Potential candidate recommendation." She described Grace's qualities, her resilience, leadership, and unshakable determination. Alina didn't embellish. She didn't need to. Grace's actions on that flight spoke volumes. Before hitting send, Alina paused. She added a final line. "We need more leaders like her. Let's give her the chance she deserves." The following weeks passed in a flurry of hearings, rulings, and conferences. Yet, amidst the demands of her schedule, Alina found herself checking her email for updates on Grace. She hadn't heard from the young woman directly, but that didn't dampen her belief that Grace would find her way forward. One crisp autumn morning, as Alina was reviewing notes for an upcoming environmental case, her assistant entered the office carrying a package. It was wrapped neatly, with a handwritten note taped to the top. The sight of it piqued Alina's curiosity. She opened the package to find a framed photo of the passengers from their emergency landing, taken outside the airport the morning after the storm. Alina's eyes scanned the faces, pausing on Grace, whose smile radiated a quiet confidence. Beneath the photo was a note in Grace's handwriting. "Justice Hayes, I don't know where to begin to thank you. Your kindness and belief in me have set my life on a new course. After our conversation, I decided to take the leap. I've applied to law schools, and I even received a call from someone who said you had recommended me. Words cannot express how much that means to me. You reminded me that I'm stronger than I thought, and that my dreams are worth pursuing. I hope to make you proud one day. With gratitude, Grace Miller." Alina leaned back in her chair, her heart swelling with pride and emotion. She traced her fingers over the words, imagining Grace reading her acceptance letter to law school one day, and perhaps even standing in a courtroom, fighting for justice just as Alina had. Alina's own journey continued, shaped by the lessons she had learned in the sky. The environmental case she had been preparing for reached its climax in court. The corporation's lawyers were formidable, but Alina's arguments, rooted in both logic and compassion, prevailed. The ruling in favor of the small community sent ripples through the legal world, setting a precedent for future cases. After the verdict, a reporter approached Alina outside the courthouse. "Justice Hayes, your rulings continue to inspire people across the country. What motivates you to keep fighting for justice?" Alina paused, considering the question carefully. Her thoughts turned to Grace, the storm, and the countless individuals whose lives intersected with hers, even briefly. "What motivates me," she said slowly, "is the belief that every individual matters, that we all have the potential to make a difference, not just in grand gestures, but in the small, quiet moments of connection." The reporter scribbled furiously, nodding. "And what's next for you?" Alina smiled. "To keep listening, to keep learning, and to keep believing in the power of resilience." Months later, Alina received another letter from Grace. This time, it was on official letterhead from a top-tier law school. Grace had been accepted, and she wanted Alina to know. The letter described how the scholarship Grace had secured would allow her to focus on her studies, and how she hoped to specialize in advocacy for marginalized communities. Alina read the letter twice, her smile widening with each word. It was a quiet evening when she framed the letter and placed it beside the photo of the passengers. The two pieces sat on her office shelf, a reminder of the storm that had tested her resolve and the connections that had changed her perspective. Years later, Alina sat in a courtroom gallery, watching as a young woman argued passionately before the bench. Grace's voice was clear, confident, and unwavering as she presented her case. Her arguments were compelling, her demeanor professional yet approachable. Alina felt a surge of pride as she saw the fire in Grace's eyes, the same fire she had glimpsed on that fateful flight. When the session ended, Grace approached Alina, her face lighting up at the sight of her mentor. "Justice Hayes," she said, her voice warm with gratitude. "Call me Alina," she replied with a chuckle. "You've earned it." Grace grinned, her confidence shining through. "I couldn't have done this without you." Alina shook her head. "You had it in you all along. I just gave you a nudge." As they parted ways, Alina felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The ripple effect of her actions had come full circle, and she knew that Grace would go on to inspire others, just as she had been inspired. The storm in the sky had been a test, but it had also been a beginning, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was light to be found. And that light, shared and nurtured, could illuminate paths for generations to come.